Today we continue our focus on the Psalms of the heart, and I'd like to focus on Psalm 77. While our musicians are walking down, just thank you once again for leading us in worship. So grateful to the Lord for each of you and for all that you're doing. Psalm 77 is our focus today under the theme, Remember and Believe. Now, when we look at these Psalms for the next number of weeks through the end of May, my intention is really simple, and that is to give expression to the deepest desires and expressions of our heart. And what you're going to discover as we go through these Psalms, that there's a lot of themes that keep repeating themselves. And that's okay. They're themes that apparently, if they are repeated in the Scriptures, obviously they need to be repeated in our lives, and we need to think about them. So Psalm 77 this morning. I cried out to God for help. I cried out to God to hear me. When I was in distress, I sought the Lord. At night I stretched out untiring hands, and I would not be comforted. I remember you, God, and I groaned. I meditated, and my spirit grew faint. You kept my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak. I thought about the former days, the years of long ago. I remembered my songs in the night. My heart meditated, and my spirit asked, will the Lord reject forever? Will he never show his favor again? Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten to be merciful? Has he in anger withheld his compassion? Then I thought, to this I will appeal, the years when the Most High stretched out his hand. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I will consider all your works and meditate on all your mighty deeds. Your ways, God, are holy. What God is as great as our God? You are the God who performs miracles. You display your power among the peoples. With your mighty arm, you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. The waters saw you, God. The waters saw you and wreathed. The very depths were convulsed. The clouds poured down water. The heavens resounded with thunder. Your arrows flashed back and forth. Your thunder was heard in the whirlwind. Your lightning lit up the world. The earth trembled and quaked. Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. You join me in prayer? Father in heaven, thank you for your good and holy word. And now we ask that by the power of your Spirit, you will show us the beauty of the gospel of Jesus Christ and the hope that we have in him. For you are the God who led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. And you are the God who leads us because we are your flock by the hand of Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. Dear friends, have you ever noticed that when it comes to life, we keep losing things? We lose wives, we lose husbands, we lose friends, we lose health, we lose our dreams, we even lose the security of the past. You look at life and we lose things. Imagine the spouse that comes home and finds the note tacked on the fridge door that says, I'm leaving. I found someone else to love. Imagine the employee who walks into the office, gave his employer 30 years of dedicated service, and is suddenly laid off. Imagine the person who received the diagnosis of terminal cancer, and that was just on the first day of retirement. Charles Haddon Spurgeon looks at this psalm, Psalm 77, and he says, this psalm gives voice to the deep glens and the lonely caves of the soul. And it's wrestling with one very simple and profound question. Has God forgotten to be gracious? Or to say it another way, has God abandoned his promise? Maybe we're asking the same question in this moment of history. Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has God abandoned his promise? And of course, the answer of this text is no. The answer of this text is, you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. That's quite an answer, really. We really don't know the context of this psalm. Some suggest that the great stress that the psalmist feels is because of the nation of Israel falling to Babylon in the year of 586 BC. Others say it really doesn't matter what the context is. When you just read the words, there is a heart, a personal heart here that has a deep, dark struggle. And whether we look at it in terms of Israel's national identity or just a personal struggle, the psalm affirms that the enemy is on the loose and there's no end in sight to this pain and this angst that is felt. And what's the conclusion? The psalmist doesn't say, we'll just see what's going on. No, the psalmist says, you led your people like a flock. And you lead your people like a flock. I've shared this before, but one way to think about God's covenant promise, because that's what this text is all about, is the promises of God. You led your people like a flock. Is to recognize that those words echo what happens in Exodus 3:15, I am he who is with you always. Which leads to a very simple profession, said best by Gerald Sitzer. Faith turns away from self and comes empty-handed to God. Faith doesn't believe in itself, it believes in God. And so this cry goes up from the psalmist. And what we're going to discover together in the promises of God is that he is faithful. He leads his people like a flock. And therefore, we take our eyes off ourselves, we come empty to God, and we trust him. Three themes when we think of God's promise: that he led and he leads his people like a flock. The promise engaged, the promise embraced, and the promise enjoyed. And they all emerge from this beautiful text. Just think of the promise engaged. You go to verses 1 through 6, and I'm not going to read them all again. But at the core in verse 3, you have these words: I remembered you, God, and I groaned. I meditated, and my spirit grew faint. And you take those words, that depth of heart struggle, and you take the rest of those 6 verses, and you see the psalmist just wrestling. Why does God allow things to go on as long as they do? Has he forgotten to be gracious? Has he abandoned his promise? And there's 2 ways we can read these words. There's what I like to call the surface view or the covenant view. And if I have a surface view, then it's just going to be about here's me and here's my circumstance and here's my darkness. But if I read a covenant view, I'm going to say here's me and here's my circumstance and here's my darkness, but better yet, here is God and here's his promise that helps me make sense of life. What's interesting in these words is that at the core, says John Calvin, these words are an invitation to a living, vigilant, alert faith. A living, vigilant, alert trust in the promises of God. In fact, this prayer is actually an engagement with God, an engagement with his promises. These are not words of despair. Let me say that first. These are not words of despair. In fact, if you take verses 1 through 6 and put it in the context of the whole psalm, here's the first thing you discover. That the psalmist moves from himself and his circumstance all the way to God and his promises. And all you got to do is look at the references to God and the references to the first personal pronouns. In verses 1 through 6, there are 18 occurrences of the first person pronoun and only 6 references to God. In verses 7 through 12, we begin to see a transition take place. There are only 5 occurrences of the first person pronoun, and then there are 13 references to God. And then you get to the last verses, verses 13 through 20, and there are 0 occurrences of the first person pronoun, and there are 21 references to God. And there is this movement through the whole psalm of, I'm going to pour out my soul, but I'm going to move away from that. I'm not going to despair and throw myself into a world of self-pity, but I'm going to thrust myself and entrust myself into the promises of God. You led and you lead your people like a flock. And if there's no despair, then there is no desperation. There is a movement from his circumstance to God's promises. And all of the best commentators say, how do we engage the promise of God? How do we engage that promise so that we mitigate fear and we mitigate the tendency to have circumstances break our courage to live? And the answer is given all the way in the New Testament in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7, where Peter says, cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. And that's what's happening in this psalm. This writer is not taking life into his own hands. This psalmist is not trying to find his own solutions, his own answers. He's simply taking the depth of his circumstance in his heart, and he says, Lord, it's your promise, we are your people, and now this is your plan in which I entrust myself. Cast all your cares on him. Why? Because he led his people like a flock. And he leads his people like a flock. Well, if that's the promise engaged in prayer, then we move on to the second theme, and that is the promise embraced. It's one thing to engage it. It's quite another thing to embrace it. And I find the questions in verses 7, 8, and 9 to be really interesting. They're critical, rhetorical questions that are carefully written, words carefully chosen, that cut to the core of the meaning of God's promise. Will the Lord reject forever? Will he never show his favor again? Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten to be merciful? Has he in anger withheld his compassion? Do you notice the words? reject forever, never show favor, unfailing love vanished, promises failed, forgotten to be merciful, withheld his compassion. In other words, God, are all your words just a bunch of smoke that you blow around and they have no value and they have no meaning in our life? Can you, God, be trusted? Can I embrace the promise? And the unequivocal answer of the psalmist is absolutely. Because then, in verses 10 through 19, he answers all of those rhetorical questions. In fact, in verses 10 through 12, he says, "You can trust my promise. I did not reject, but I've shown favor. Remember the years of the right hand of the Most High. You've seen my word in action. You've seen my promises in action. Didn't I send Moses while you were in Egypt and he led you out? Didn't I provide Esther in the face of evil Haman? Didn't I protect David in the threats of Saul? Am I not that kind of God?" And then in verses 13 through 15, he says, "You really believe my love has vanished, that I have not kept my promises? Then what about with your mighty arm I redeemed you, my people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph? You haven't just seen my promise in action, you've seen it in action from generation to generation." My promise, my word, my love, says Peter, endures forever. And then in verses 16 through 19, he says, "I've not forgotten my mercy. I've not withheld my compassion. My mercy led you out of Egypt. My compassion led you into the promised land." But here's the words I love. It says, "Your path led through the sea." The sea representing every conceivable chaos and difficulty and darkness is a description that the psalmist constantly gives. God says, "I entered the waters with you, the Red Sea, the Jordan River, and the raging storms of life." Now, friends, think hard with me for a moment about that. Because what the psalmist is saying reaches all the way to Jesus and all the way to the Apostle Paul and all the way to our lives today. You've seen my promise in action. You've seen it from generation to generation. You've seen Jesus enter the waters of baptism. And what was said there? "You are my son whom I love. With you I am well pleased." That's what God did with Israel when they went through the Red Sea and the Jordan River. "You are my children whom I love. With you I am well pleased." That's what he says in Jesus. In fact, the Apostle Paul says when we are baptized in Jesus Christ, we become children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in Jesus Christ. "You are my children whom I love. With you I am well pleased." That's my promise. And so often we misunderstand the character of our relationship with God, of his promises. Sometimes I feel like the faith, and let me just complain for 2 minutes, okay? Just 2. Sometimes I feel like the faith comes down to one of two problems. One, it's sort of a happy faith that says, honk if you love Jesus. Just smile and you'll somehow just muster the energy to get through this thing. Is that what Jesus did? When he took on human flesh and he marched to Gethsemane and to Golgotha and the cross, Did Jesus say this isn't a big deal? Just honk and smile. We'll get through this thing? No. Sweat like drops of blood because of the horror of human suffering. The promises of God do not ignore the seriousness of human struggle and pain and darkness. Or the other extreme, sort of health and wealth faith, that if I just have a strong enough faith, a strong enough prayer life, a strong enough this, that somehow God is then just going to fix me. You never hear Jesus teach that. There isn't a single text. And what this psalm is saying is, God in Christ joins us in the waters. The problem with that other stuff is that it's really just a form of consumer Christianity. That if I just do these things, if I muster my energy, if I echo my prayers, if I do my stuff, then somehow I can purchase the blessing of God and everything will be all right. God says, not a chance. All that is going to do is earn you desperation and despair because you and I and we don't have what it takes to get through human struggle and pain on our own. And Jesus enters the waters because Jesus is the promise. You are the children I love. With you I'm well pleased, and nothing can separate you from my love. I am the God who led you and leads you like a flock. Well, if that's the promise engaged and the promise embraced, then friends, it's also the promise that is enjoyed. I love these words of verse 20. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Moses, the great deliverer, Aaron, the wonderful priest. And little did they know that they were an Old Testament picture of the New Testament Christ, the great deliverer, Jesus, the great priest who suffers with us because he suffers for us. And when I read those words of verse 20, you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. God saying he's a tender shepherd who loves his sheep. It takes me back to the familiar words of Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Have you ever just asked yourself, what is the greatest miracle we see in the Bible? Is it that the blind see? That's pretty awesome when that happens. Is it when the lame walk? It's pretty awesome. Was it when Lazarus was raised from the dead? That would have been cool to see too. Or is it when Jesus changed the water to wine? That's where I put my number one vote. But as wonderful as all those are, none of them are the greatest miracle ever performed. The greatest miracle that we find in the pages of the Scriptures, friends, is that Jesus Christ condescends, joins us in human suffering, and makes himself a slave to death. You ever thought of that? That's why when you read Psalm 23, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Think about those words. He enters the valley of the shadow of death before us and with us and for us. And that rod is the authority of Jesus Christ that has conquered the powers of evil, that have conquered the powers of death, and that give light and hope at the end of the tunnel. And that staff that the psalmist talks about, that staff is simply his compassion and his mercy that says, I am with you. And better than that, it says, and I know you by name, you are mine. When we're walking in the darkness, and we can't see, and we can't understand, and we can't put it together, and John in his Gospel, chapter 15 says, but the great shepherd Jesus, we know his voice, and he knows our name, and he sees us, and he's gently leading and guiding us through the dark valleys of the shadows of death. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. And then you go to the book of Revelation, and it says this about Jesus. It says the lion has come, and he is the ruler of the heavens of the earth. So don't weep and wail. Because when you look at the throne, you'll see the lion has become the lamb. And it's the lamb who has conquered the powers of evil. Don't weep, friends, but trust the promises of God that I am he who is with you always. In fact, this whole psalm, the promise engaged, the promise embraced, the promise enjoyed says this. Suffering, in fact, becomes the lens through which we clearly see God's faithfulness. And his suffering is our true freedom from a life of desperation and despair, because I am he who is with you always. And I've led you like a flock. I know you by name, and nothing can separate you from my love. So this psalm, as Spurgeon said, gives voice to the deep glens and the lonely caves of the soul. But it also affirms that God has not forgotten to be gracious. God has not abandoned his promise. And we are, the delight of the gift of his Son. When I put that all together, then I respond with the words of the Heidelberg Catechism. Because God leads us like a flock, we can be patient when things go against us, thankful when things go well, and for the future, we can have good confidence in our faithful God and Father that nothing can separate us from his love. Because you led and you lead your people like a flock. Will you pray with me?